A lot has changed in the past week in the baseball world, and we are here to break it all down. Happy Tuesday, everyone. I'm Chris Brown, and thank you for tuning in for the debut of Around the Bases here on the 110 Sports Network, streaming at 110sportsmedia.com/live. We'll be here at this time, 1 p.m. Eastern, every Tuesday and Thursday to bring you the very latest news, storylines, updates, and analysis involving Major League Baseball. The shows will also be available on demand at 110sportsmedia.com and in podcast form on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. Just search for 110 Sports. It is actually week 2 here at 110 Sports, and we already have 2 great shows airing here throughout the week in addition to this one. The J Mole Show with Josh Molinix airs on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern. And Touchline Talk with Josh Doring, talking all things soccer, airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at the same time slot. The original intent was actually for this show to be joining those other 2 in launching last week, but actually this time last Tuesday we did not even have a plan ironed out for Major League Baseball yet. Negotiations between the players and the owners had stopped, but the league was still waiting on players to approve of health and safety measures and agree on a report date for spring training under MLB's implementation of a schedule per the March agreement between the 2 sides. By last Tuesday evening, the Players Association tweeted that the players were set to report to spring training camps, and we have baseball on the horizon. In fact, we're just one day from players reporting for spring training 2.0, or training camp, or summer training, whatever you want to call it. That day is tomorrow. It was certainly a messy road for baseball to get to this point. The negotiations between the 2 sides, the players and the owners, couldn't be characterized as anything other than just a disaster. And the tension that exists between the 2 sides is real, and it's not going away anytime soon. But there will be plenty of time to talk about that. I would imagine, like me, you're probably tired of hearing about all the back and forth, the bickering between the 2 sides, and much more excited about the prospect of baseball in 2020, which appears to be on the horizon, and that's what we're going to focus on for most of today's show. So the shape of this program is going to vary a little bit show to show, and of course once we have baseball regular season games, the topics are going to change, the nature of the show will change a little bit. But here is the rundown for today's first show. We're going to start by breaking down, taking a quick look at some of the major headlines across the sport. We'll do this every show, just a quick 4 or 5 major headlines, storylines, whether that's an injury-related thing, a team that's hot, a team that's cold, whatever the big storylines in baseball are at the time, we'll break those down for you, and we'll start with that today. Then we're going to go ahead and take a little time and talk about some of the challenges that baseball faces in its efforts to restart in the middle of the pandemic. There's certainly some challenges there. It's not a super fun topic because it involves some less than optimistic elements to it. So we're not going to focus on it too much, but we are going to sort of go through the reality check of some of the obstacles that baseball faces and how hard it's going to be, just to sort of set the scene that this isn't easy, it's not perfect. We'll go through that, and then we'll get to a little bit more of the fun stuff, which is, for today, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact that a reduced schedule and that the rules changes that are going to be in place this year could have on the game. And really, it seems pretty simple. Generally, you're cutting a 60-game season, and just a couple of rules changes. None of them are huge, with the exception of really 2. Yet, I think there's a lot of impacts of those rule changes, and particularly the shortened season, that could have a major impact on the 2 months of regular season baseball that we're going to have starting in the end of July. Next up, near the end, we'll talk about some teams that could particularly benefit from the shortened season. So there's going to be a case that could be made that a lot of teams benefit in some way or another, and there could be an argument that a lot of teams are harmed in some ways as well. But I think I pulled a couple of teams, 5 teams that I think are likely to benefit potentially more than others and be uniquely situated for this 60-game season to be successful. A lot of that is injury related, and we'll talk about that coming up. So let's go ahead and dive right into the headlines right now. We'll go ahead and start with some of the basics of laying the groundwork of the season as it looks right now. And this isn't particularly breaking news. This information has been coming in over the past week, but just sort of to lay the groundwork for people who may not have been paying too close of attention these last couple weeks. Just lay the groundworks of what the season looks like right now. So after weeks of unproductive negotiations, you probably heard about them, between the players and the owners, Commissioner Rob Manfred mandated a schedule under the March agreement between the two sides. That schedule is for 60 games, with regular season play beginning July 23rd and 24th. The makeup of those 60 games is 40 games against teams in your division and 20 games against teams in the counter division of the other league. So the easiest way to put that is NL Central teams, for example, will play 40 games against NL Central teams, and 20 games against AL Central teams. The full schedules have not yet been released, and they're still being worked out. It could be a few days or even a week, it seems like, before we get full schedules. That's understandable. There are a variety of factors in play here and trying to get this figured out on the fly. Teams are going to play at their home ballparks when possible, unlike other leagues, notably the NBA, who's using the bubble approach in playing in all their games in Disney World in Florida. Players are reporting for Spring Training 2.0, as I mentioned, tomorrow, July 1st. Most of those are going to be held at teams' home ballparks, not their spring training sites. And the first workouts for many teams are on Friday. There's a wide variety of health and safety measures that are going to be taken this year, including testing every other day for COVID-19 for players and essential personnel. There's also, as we teased at the top, some rules changes, including the implementation of a universal DH and a runner on second base to start extra innings, as well as some changes to roster construction. And we'll talk about those a little bit later on. As I mentioned, we'll look at the impact of the reduced schedule as well. Second major headline is Sunday was the deadline for teams to submit their initial spring training player pools. So players cannot participate in Spring Training 2.0 or play in the regular season without being included on the list, which can include for each team up to 60 players. Now, many teams submitted fewer than 60 names, and they can change those pools as they want throughout the season. They can add names very easily. The catch is that any player removed from the pools for reasons that are not related to injury or suspension will be exposed to other organizations on waivers, which is why you see teams not filling up the whole 60 names just yet out of the gate. They're going to wait. They're going to see. They're going to have players who they could potentially add to that list later on. Among some notable names that were included on their team's list, New York Mets outfielder Yoenis Cespedes, who missed, if you'll remember, all of 2019 after undergoing multiple right ankle surgeries. And Cardinals outfielder Dylan Carlson, the 21-year-old top prospect, was one of the more impressive hitters in Spring Training 1.0 and is in contention to potentially see significant time in the outfield for the Cardinals this year. Among some notable names that were not included on their team's list, these are all mostly due to injuries, but just a quick reminder about some of those injuries, some players that won't be playing this year, or likely won't be. Seattle outfielder Mitch Haniger was placed on the 60-day IL. He's recovering from a second core surgery and back operation. It seems unlikely he'll play this year, but we don't know that yet. New York Yankees starting pitcher Luis Severino underwent Tommy John surgery back in February and will not pitch until 2021. Chris Archer of the Pirates, he will not pitch this season after undergoing surgery for thoracic outlet syndrome earlier this month. And if you'll remember, Baltimore outfielder and first baseman Trey Mancini underwent surgery back in March to remove a tumor from his colon. All reports indicate he's doing well, but he is going to sit out this season. Our third news headline of the day, some notable signings in the past couple of days. The transactions freeze that had been in effect throughout the major leagues for the past couple of months, ever since baseball got shut down back in March, was lifted on Friday, and there have been a number of notable minor league deals since then. No huge deals, but the New York Mets signed a couple of familiar names. Veteran outfielder Melky Cabrera, former White Sox infielder Gordon Beckham, and former Giants reliever Hunter Strickland were among the Mets signings that were notable. And the Colorado Rockies, just this morning, it's been reported they signed outfielder and designated hitter Matt Kemp to a contract after the Marlins decided to exclude Kemp from their 60-man player pool. and Kemp replaces for the Rockies a player who we'll talk about more momentarily. The biggest name that's out there still unsigned right now was Yasiel Puig. He's been connected to the Giants significantly, though we haven't seen any significant reports or news of a signing lately. That could happen any day now. And our final headline here, which is pretty timely at this point, some players and coaches are going to sit out the 2020 MLB season. Well, I will tell you, when I first started writing these notes yesterday morning, there was only speculation that one player might opt out. Now we have 4 known major leaguers, at last check, have opted out of the 2020 season. Arizona veteran starting pitcher Mike Leake became the first known major leaguer to opt out of the season on Monday. Then Washington Nationals, the face of the franchise Ryan Zimmerman, announced just hours later he will not play this season. He has 3 young children, including a newborn and a mother, at high risk. It could be the end of Zimmerman's career, but he noted in a statement he hasn't decided about his future in baseball just yet. Also, Washington Nationals, his teammate, Zimmerman's teammate, right-handed pitcher Joe Ross, who was expected to be the 5th starter for the Nationals, has also opted out of the season. And former Washington National and current Colorado Rockies outfielder Ian Desmond announced last night in a very powerful, personal, emotional statement on Instagram that he would be opting out of the season as well. It was, as I mentioned, really powerful. Basically an essay posted on Instagram by Desmond, which I would encourage everyone to read. He ends it with talking about how he's made the decision not to play in 2020. He said at the end of his statement, quote, "With a pregnant wife and 4 young children who have lots of questions about what's going on in the world, home is where I need to be right now. Home for my wife, home to help, home to guide, home to answer my older 3 boys' questions about coronavirus and civil rights and life, home to be their dad," end quote. And it's definitely important perspective to keep during this time. And also, Desmond, in that post on Instagram, touched on a number of different topics involving racism in baseball, what's going on in this country right now. It's really a must-read for anybody who's interested in baseball. In addition to players, there are going to be some coaches who do not participate in the 2020 season. At this point, there's been no managers who are not participating, but there has been a word that the Twins, for example, they have 2 coaches who will not be working games this year due to health and safety concerns. So we're likely to see more players, potentially more coaches opting out of the season. Wouldn't be surprised if we're getting news of that, more players, coaches today. We shall see. We'll revisit this on Thursday. At this point, no quote-unquote stars have announced that they're not playing in 2020, but some significant names, certainly, in Leake and Zimmerman, Desmond, and Ross. All right, let's go ahead and shift gears now, if we finish the headlines there, and talk about some of the challenges baseball is going to face in its restart efforts. And we'll go through this pretty quickly. We don't have to spend a whole bunch of time on this, but at the same time, it's also really important. And just because we're not going to spend a lot of time on it doesn't mean it's not important, because the big question right now, people are still wondering, or still saying they'll believe that there's baseball in 2020 when they see baseball in 2020. And that's fair, given the circumstances of what's going on in this country right now. Will we actually see baseball in 2020? We're a few weeks away from it now. It's getting closer, but we have yet to see a league of the size and scope of Major League Baseball return yet. The NHL has not yet returned. The NBA is slated to return in late July. Obviously, we've seen some sports action return to the country, in racing, in NWSL action is returning, but has not been an undertaking like this yet. There are still a lot of questions. We have a schedule set, actually not set. We have a plan for a schedule, agreed to, framework for a schedule, but a whole lot can change in just a couple of weeks. 11 of the 30 MLB teams are located in either Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, or California. And all those states have been among recent hotspots for coronavirus across the country. One general manager told Sports Illustrated's Tom Verducci just a couple years ago, "I think it's 50-50. We even get to the starting line." That was his quote. And it's important to note that MLB's plan for a restart is inherently more risky than some other leagues who are using or planning to use the bubble approach, like the NBA, like the WNBA, like the NWSL. Unlike those leagues, there's not going to be containment of players in one location, and players are going to be allowed to, when they're in their home cities, go home, which is good. I mean, obviously you want to restrict access, you want to restrict players as little as possible, but there's inherently more risk in a system like that than there is in a bubble system where you try to contain the environment like they're planning to do in the NBA. There's also going to be more COVID-19 cases for players. There already have been. Obviously, it got some of the headlines last week. 3 Rockies, including Charlie Blackmon, tested positive for coronavirus. There were some unnamed players at spring training facilities in Florida and Arizona, which led the league to shut down all spring training facilities temporarily. There are a lot of questions here, just like in the real world, just like in the country right now. In the non-sports world, there are a lot of questions in the sports world when it comes to restarting sports in this country. How well can the situation be controlled in a day-to-day environment? At what point does it become too much? Those are a few of the major questions, just a few of them. There is no playbook for this. In the country, in the sports world right now, we don't know what's going to happen. The health manual for Major League Baseball's return is 101 pages long. And there's going to be so many things that happen that will require changes to that were not foreseen in that manual. It's just not comprehensive. It could be 200 pages long, and it wouldn't be comprehensive for what's going to happen. There's a chance this all ends before the season ever even gets started. There's a chance we have a regular season for like 2 weeks, and then it all gets shut down. And there's a chance that the entire season and the postseason are played, and things go relatively well, considering the circumstances. But there is, again, I'll say it again, it's just important to stress, there's no playbook for this. We don't know how this is going to play out. We don't know for sure that there's going to be baseball in 3 weeks, or that there'll be a full season, a full regular season, a postseason, but certainly can hope for the best. And, there really isn't a great end to this segment. There's no great, but everything will be fine. The fact of the matter is we just kind of have to accept the uncertainty right now and realize that nothing is guaranteed, and that includes the sports world right now. But we can certainly hope for the best and hope that we're able to have a baseball season in the near future that gets played out with good success. All right, so we'll go ahead and shift gears now. Now that we've said that, because that's important to say, important to acknowledge the risks that are involved, that this is tricky, but the more exciting part is to think about what the baseball season would look like, is likely to look like in a shortened season with the rules changes. There's going to be a lot that's different, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the impact of the rules changes that are going to be in place this season. So there's 2 big ones that people are talking about. One is the universal DH, so the DH is going to be in the National League this season, and that helps a number of different NL teams and players in individual situations. The Mets' Yoenis Cespedes is likely to, it looks like he could be a candidate to DH for them. As we mentioned, he missed last season. He hasn't played in most of the last 2 seasons due to different injuries, but we know what kind of electric bat he can be. So he could be a real candidate to have a great season if he's able to DH a good bit. For the Washington Nationals, Howie Kendrick had an amazing season. The veteran last year had an incredible season for the Nationals, helped them to their World Series championship. Especially with Ryan Zimmerman not playing this year, he could see increased time, add in the DH, and it seems likely he'll play a good bit. The Atlanta Braves have a bit of a overflow in their outfield. A good problem to have, but we could see Marcell Ozuna getting time in the DH role. For the Cubs, Kyle Schwarber, the former catcher, out in left field, is not a defensive wizard, to say the least, and he could see some time in the DH role. Also, Ryan Braun of the Brewers could see some time in the DH role. So there are certainly a lot of NL teams that are better situated to, just have a ready-made DH or someone who will take a lot of time at the DH role. Other NL teams are going to take more of a mix and match approach. And that's fine, The idea of the universal DH, the DH coming to the National League, has been a debate, a topic of discussion for several years now, and it's sort of been the consensus in recent years that it's coming eventually. It's just a matter of time before the NL adopts the DH. And now that it's set to happen for this season, I noticed that the reaction to this seemed generally either positive or indifferent. I didn't see a lot of outrage. I'm sure there are people who are, because that's always going to be the case. But I didn't see a lot of outrage about the idea of the universal DH in 2021. I would bet, as I've seen a lot of reporters, baseball reporters who are plugged in, talking about that the DH is going to be here to stay. It's important to note that it has not been agreed upon for 2021. It's only for this season. I would bet it's here to stay. We shall see. And my take is I guess you would think, do I have a hot take for it? I don't have a hot take. I think it's fine. I think it's okay to have the DH come to the National League. There's a part of me that doesn't like it. The baseball traditionalist part of me doesn't like it. There's something, there's always the talk of the strategy that's involved with the pitcher hitting and pinch hitting and all these strategy that goes into it. But adding the DH is going to make the game in the National League more interesting. It's going to decrease the injury risk for pitchers. I always think of Adam Wainwright tearing his Achilles, running out of the batter's box, and was never the same since, in large part due to age, but there's less injury risk to pitchers that way. Yes, some amazing moments happen when pitchers hit home runs or get hits, but that's such a small percentage. And there's the idea that it could prolong the careers of some great hitters. We've seen what the DH has done to the careers of players in the American League like Nelson Cruz and Edwin Encarnacion. And the idea that more players could have an opportunity to prolong their careers as great hitters by having that DH spot open. Plus the decreased injury risk to pitchers and more action there's going to be, more hits, more balls put in play. I think overall I'm okay with it. Now the more controversial rules change is the runner on second base in extra innings. That one I have a harder time with, because that's just such a fundamental change about the way you play the game, and that all of a sudden you get to extra innings and now we're going to get you halfway to scoring a run. The traditionalist part of me really doesn't like that. It's definitely the change I've seen the most frustration expressed about online. But I will say this. It makes sense in the context of the season. These teams are going to be playing 60 games in 66 days. It's going to be a marathon. Yes, it's not going to be 162 games, but it's a lot of games in a pretty short amount of time. And given the situation, baseball does not want to have 15, 16, 17, 18 inning games. I understand that, and I think that in that context, it makes sense for this season. I'm not sold on it moving forward because it's such in my opinion, a fundamental change of the game. I'm not sold on it moving forward for seasons moving forward, but in some sense, this is sort of the perfect environment to test it in. Because this season's already so wacky, there's already going to be so many weird things happening. And it makes sense to try it out and use it for this season. Let's try it out now, see how it goes, and then we'll see if it stays in place moving forward in 2021. I'm definitely not sold yet, but I'm willing to see how it plays out. I wouldn't be surprised if the increased drama of it all, the increased action, the suspense, the pressure makes it more exciting to the point that fans like it enough that it will probably stay as well. And I'm not sold on that yet, but I'm willing to see how it plays out in this season. And like I said, it's the perfect environment to try it out. So a quick rundown of some of the other rules changes this season. Suspended games are going to be treated a little bit differently. If weather forces a game to be cut short before it goes official, it'll be continued at a later date rather than started from scratch. That makes sense given the short season and the circumstances. Social distancing on the field is going to be tricky. Players and managers are required to maintain social distance from umpires and opponents. Players and managers who get close to each other in arguments or fights will face immediate ejection and discipline. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Obviously, it's understandable why these rules are in place, but I have to imagine at some point, if these players, it may happen anyway. There may be fights, disputes. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The wet rag, pitchers will be able to carry a small wet rag in their back pocket instead of licking their fingers. That makes sense given the circumstances. And then some roster changes. We talked about the 60-man player pool. There's not going to be likely any minor league baseball this year, which means that teams are going to be more likely to include some top prospects who would normally be playing at AA or AAA this season on their 60-man player pool, or at least leaving spots open for them potentially join the 60-man player pool. And whether or not we see some top prospects who are slated to be at AA or AAA is going to kind of depend on the team situation. A lot of teams that could be contenders are going to probably at least leave a spot open for that prospect. Teams like the Orioles, who are not going to compete even in a season like this, are more likely to maybe still leave prospects off to not start their service clock. Finally, the trade deadline is being moved from July 31st to August 31st. How many trades will we actually see? That's hard to tell. It's a really weird situation that we have here for potential trading this year. On the one hand, it's only a month into the season. On the other hand, it's halfway into the season that teams will have to make the decision on whether to trade players or not. It'll be interesting to see how many teams are actually out of it by the August 31st deadline. People have mentioned Francisco Lindor as a potential trade candidate. I would be a little bit surprised if the Indians were that far out of it by then, but we'll see. It's just another quirk that'll make this season really interesting to watch to see if we have trades in abundance or not. All right. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and take our first break, a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the impact of the shortened schedule itself, as well as some teams that could benefit the most from the shortened season. Stay with us. You're watching Around the Bases on the 110 Sports Network. All right, welcome back, everybody, to Around the Bases from 110 Sports here on the 110 Sports Network, streaming at 110sportsmedia.com/live. I'm Chris Brown, and we talked last segment about the impact that the various rules changes that are going to be in place this season could have on baseball. We're now going to talk a little bit about the impact of the reduced schedule. And there's really, it seems simple. You go from 162 games down to 60 games. But that's a big drop off for a sport where things tend to balance out over the course of a summer. Players and teams will go through really good, really hot, big hot streaks and cold streaks. Particularly players' individual performances players will have really bad months, really bad couple of months, and then they'll pull it together. And we've seen instances in recent years. We saw Jack Flaherty go from not very good the first couple months of last season to one of the best pitchers of all time down the stretch for the final several months of the season. We've seen Lance Lynn start seasons really poorly, and then he went on an incredible run last year himself. We saw the Washington Nationals get off to a horrible start last season and then pull it together. So baseball is really a sport where things are going to balance out over time. So a change from 162 games down to 60 is really significant. And I think it's going to lead to a number of different impacts throughout the game that are going to make this season weird, but also make it exciting. I think there's going to be an increased sense of urgency because the value of one game itself is higher towards a team's overall record than it would be in a regular season. The Hall of Fame writer Jason Stark with The Athletic crunched the numbers or looked at the numbers. They're not hard numbers to crunch, but pointed out that a 7-game losing streak in a 60-game season is the equivalent of losing 19 games in a row in a 162-game season. So teams are not going to want, losses. A 7-game losing streak is not that hard to go on. A 5, 6, 7-game losing streak is not that hard to go on. But you get off to a start like that if you're a team, and it's going to be a lot to dig out of in a season where there's just 60 games. As a result, I think pitching strategies are going to vary wildly from team to team. Some managers will probably handle their rotation and their pitching staff relatively normally. Obviously, we're going to see starting pitchers pitch more like 3 or 4 innings out of the gate in their first start or two rather than 7 or 8 innings most likely. But other managers, and especially down the stretch, managers could go to a more playoff-like approach with their pitching staff. They could go 4-man rotation. They could go, we could see closers pitching more innings in tight games. We could see ace starters pitching in relief in close games down the stretch. We could see some really wacky things happening because of this increased sense of urgency. Teams cannot afford to be super patient with pitchers because they're only going to be making like 10 or 11 starts, maybe 12 starts this season. So whether it's a young pitcher where the team is just betting on the talent, they'll figure it out at the major league level, or an established, known arm, a veteran pitcher who teams are betting that eventually they'll level out because they're a known quantity, they'll figure it out. That would happen in a regular season where players will go through bad stretches, starters will go through bad stretches, and teams will stick with them. But if you're only making 11 starts in a season and you go out there and your first 3 or 4 are bad, and the games matter that much more, we could see some managers and some teams making some interesting decisions. Whether it's a young talent who we all think's going to be great and probably still will be great, but he gets off to a bad start and the team has to pull the plug, or maybe we see a veteran player get off to a really bad start and at some point the team can't wait and sit around hoping that things will work themselves out, because if they never do, then that's 12 starts, 10 starts out of 60 games from a pitcher who's bad all season. That's really, really going to hurt you. More teams are going to have a shot in this shortened season, and races could come down to the wire like we've never seen before. teams with some up-and-coming talent, young players who were not expected to be super competitive this season, might just be able to put together a great stretch. And so there are a couple of teams that come to mind for me with this. The Blue Jays, with the young talent that they have, Vladimir Guerrero Jr., Bo Bichette, Cavan Biggio. They signed Hyunjin Ryu. This is a team with a lot of young talent and a young core coming up, and most teams, well, most people wouldn't bet them to win the AL East in a really competitive division, or even make a wild card spot in a normal season. But they're the kind of team that if enough players click, stay healthy, we could see them make a run. We could see that the same sort of thing for the White Sox. They've got an incredible amount of young talent and young pitching. If enough of those guys are at pitching and performing, hitting at a high level, we could see them make a run. Same for the Padres. Same to some extent for the Reds in an NL Central that's pretty wide open. We talked about, I mentioned a minute ago, races could go down to the wire like never before. I was looking at some projections, and there are many different projection systems for standings. One of them is the ZiPS projections. And the ZiPS projections for the NL Central, just as one example, had 4 teams within 1 game of each other in the final standings. It showed the Cubs with 32 wins, and the Brewers, Cardinals, and Reds with 31 wins, and even the Pirates had 26. They were not that far behind. That's just one example, and we don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, these are just projections, but that's 4 teams within 1 game in the NL Central. I mean, this could really come down to the wire, which could be really exciting in September and make September baseball more exciting than it often is across the league. I mean, obviously there are always circumstances, playoff races going down to the wire in September, but for the most part, it's usually just 1 or 2 races that are really, really exciting near the end. This could be, every division could be really tight, down to the wire. It could be really exciting. Some teams are going to have it easier than others in this shortened season, just because of the nature of the schedule itself. As I mentioned, 40 games are going to be against teams in your division. 20 are going to be against teams in the corresponding division of the other league. So again, Jason Stark looked at the numbers and found that based on last year's records, the Twins and Indians have the easiest schedule. They faced just 4 teams with a winning record last year. Meanwhile, the Marlins, Orioles, and Blue Jays will play 7 teams with records of 500 or better last year. That they had the hardest schedule in terms of last year's records. You'll notice the 2 teams with the easiest schedule in that exercise are from the AL Central, and that's likely to be the case because the AL Central is the only division where there are 2 teams that are in full rebuild mode. That's Kansas City and Detroit. Most divisions have just 1 team that's really in full rebuild mode and with no chance to compete this year. So it makes sense that the teams that are, with the increase in playing division opponents, the teams in the division with the generally weakest opponents, the good teams in those divisions are going to have it the easier schedule. So it's not going to be perfectly fair, but that's just the nature of the way things are going to be this season, and we just have to accept that and live with that. There are a couple other impacts that we could see with the reduced schedule this season that I think are going to be interesting. First off, the very best teams are probably still going to have the best records. Probably. So Jeremy Frank, who is at MLB Random Stats on Twitter, a really popular Twitter account, really worthwhile Twitter account if you're a baseball fan, looked at each MLB team's best and worst 60-game stretches last season. So it's not the beginning of the first 60 games or the last 60 games, the best and worst 60-game stretches. So among the best stretches in the American League, the best records were the Cleveland Indians, Houston Astros, New York Yankees, and then the Minnesota Twins. In the NL, the best 60-game stretches were the Dodgers, Nationals, Braves, and Cardinals. So, last year at least, it's not as if there was a truly bad team that had an incredible 60-game stretch that would have landed them in the playoffs if the season was just those 60 games. It's also interesting to look at the worst 60-game stretches for each team last season. In the AL, the best worst stretches. So the teams that that played the best even in their worst 60-game stretch in the AL were the Yankees, Astros, and Twins. In the NL, the Dodgers, Braves, and Cubs. All pretty good teams, if not great teams. So this shows us that even in the worst 60-game stretches, the best teams seem to fare the best. They don't go on big slides. But it's important to note that this is uncharted territory. So who really knows? It's also important to note that there's extra motivation the teams have this season, knowing that they have 60 games for the whole season to put everything into, rather than we're just cherry picking, or not cherry picking, we're just selecting 60 game stretches out of a season in which players know they're playing 162 games. They're going to pace themselves differently. So what this exercise means exactly is hard to tell. Nothing's guaranteed here, but I think in general, we're not going to see something incredibly fluky in terms of the Marlins going out there and making the playoffs, or the Orioles, being in it till the end. I don't think that's going to happen. A couple other points about the impact of the reduced schedule. Someone is going to do something incredible statistically. Some player may hit around 400. We could see a pitcher post an ERA around 1. It could be anything. We don't know what the stat's going to be. We could see a guy go out there and steal at a pace that would be, 70 steals across 162 games, or hit home runs at a historic pace, even though the total numbers won't be that high. It's impossible to know. It's all just speculation of who could do that. The batting average one, people have talked about, Jose Altuve, Cody Bellinger, DJ LeMahieu. They're definitely candidates to, hit 400 in a shortened season, and obviously they're good candidates, but it's all just speculation. So it's fun. Someone is going to do something incredible statistically, though. The best player in baseball this year, the best pitcher, the best hitter, could be someone you just don't expect at all. In fact, it probably will be. Final point about the impact of the reduced schedule. Players will get injured more frequently, particularly pitchers. Pitchers are not used to this. They're creatures of habit in many ways, as it's been described time and time again. Pitchers are not used to this starting and stopping again. The spring training 2.0 is going to be shorter. It's going to be less stretched out. The pitchers are going to be less stretched out, that is. Some pitchers will be fine with it. Others are probably going to struggle. It's impossible to really predict what pitchers may struggle out of the gate and potentially lead to teams making difficult decisions about established arms. But there are probably going to be more pitching injuries this season, and more injuries overall. All right, so we're going to go ahead and shift gears here to our final main topic of the day, which is some teams that could benefit from the shortened season. I selected 5 teams here that I think could particularly benefit in one way or another from the shortened season. And now, like I said before, you can make the case for pretty much every team benefiting in some way or another because some player is healthy that wouldn't have been healthy. You could also make the case that a lot of teams are going to be hurt by it. You could say, well, some of these teams on this list here, these 5 teams, could also be hurt by the shortened season. And those would be valid arguments as well. But I selected these 5 teams. We'll go ahead and go through them that have various reasons why I think they could benefit from the shortened season. A lot of it does have to do with injuries in many cases. We'll start with the Houston Astros, and this one explanation here, the first part of it is a little bit dumb, but there are not going to be fans in the stands to boo them regarding the sign-stealing scandal. There's not going to be able to be the same media scrutiny and fan scrutiny on a day-to-day basis that there would be if this season had played out normally. And it's impossible to quantify the impact of that. But I think it is worth noting there could be an impact to that. We're never going to know what that impact could be because we're not going to see the alternative universe in which things went off normally. But there's another reason the Astros are on this list as well. Justin Verlander's going to be healthy. He's not going to be on the injured list like he would have been if the season had started on time, and he's going to be especially important for them with Garrett Cole gone. Garrett Cole now a New York Yankee. They're also going to have Lance McCullers getting more recovery time in his return from Tommy John surgery, and they're going to really hope for something significant from him also with Cole gone this season. Second team on this list is the Washington Nationals. They were the oldest team in baseball last season. Of course, they made that deep run in the playoffs all the way to winning the World Series, and they depend significantly on the arms of Max Scherzer and Steven Strasburg. Both of them have injury histories. Scherzer has been very durable in recent years, but he dealt with some back problems last year. Wouldn't be surprised to see those creep up again. And Steven Strasburg has a well-documented injury history himself. Both those pitchers pitched really deep into the postseason. Both were crucial to the Nationals' success, and both have now had a good amount of time to rest up and recover. And even if the Nationals make another World Series run, they will not be throwing as many innings as they would in a regular season. New York Yankees are the third team on this list. This team dealt with a lot of injuries to big bats last season, but they overcame it because in large part because they had so many other hitters. They had so much great offensive depth. Giovanni Urshela came out of nowhere to be an incredible hitter for them. Gleyber Torres had an outstanding season, but they still want their big bats in the outfield healthy, and that's Aaron Judge and Giancarlo Stanton, who were both slated to miss the beginning of the 2020 season with injuries. Stanton should now be a full go for the abbreviated season. Hopefully Judge will be as well. There's some uncertainty in that situation. Also, James Paxton should be good to go for the Yankees after back surgery in early February. Was supposed to sideline him for the first few months of the season. He'll be especially important for them with the loss of Luis Severino. When the Yankees signed Garrett Cole, it was an outstanding top two with Cole and Severino, and then you had Paxton and Tanaka, who were there as 3 and 4. Now Paxton's going to be hopefully playing a bigger role for the Yankees with in that 2 spot in the rotation with Severino out for the season. Tampa Bay Rays are team number 4. They have an incredible amount of pitching depth. This is an incredible organization for developing pitchers. They have a great depth of solid arms. They do not have necessarily a ton of pitching stars, a lot of names you don't know about, but a lot of names that could be real strong arms for the team this season, and a really strong top of the rotation for the Rays that could really benefit from throwing less innings in 2020. They have a 2018 Cy Young Award winner Blake Snell, 2019 Cy Young candidate Charlie Morton, the veteran, and Tyler Glasnow, the young pitcher who battled injuries last season, but when he was healthy, in 12 starts, 11 strikeouts per 9 innings, a 178 ERA. All these guys have injury concerns, injury pasts, and if they're throwing less innings, which of course they're going to be throwing less innings in 2020, if the 3 of them can remain healthy all season, that could legitimately be one of the best top 3 in a rotation in Major League Baseball. Final team on here is the Twins. We talked about them based on last year's records. The Twins have the easiest schedule in baseball. This one, I just had to include them. We kind of basically talked about them already. They're not playing themselves, obviously, and they're in the only division with 2 teams in full rebuild mode, plus the NL Central, where they're going to play 20 games as well, doesn't have a lot of outstanding teams. They've got 4 teams that could be really good, but none that are expected to be outstanding. So those are 5 teams that could benefit from the shortened season. I'm sure I could come up with another 5 with other explanations, but those are 5 teams that came to mind that I think could particularly benefit with the shortened season. All right, we have just 10 more minutes left in the broadcast today, 1:51 Eastern. We're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, final thoughts, and we'll sign off for the day. Stay with us. You're watching Around the Bases on the 110 Sports Network. All right, welcome back to Around the Bases here on the 110 Sports Network. I'm Chris Brown here, final segment for you on this Tuesday. First, just a little bit of an odds and ends note, something I thought was interesting I saw recently. Let's appreciate the career of Melky Cabrera a little bit. I mentioned at the top of the show the veteran outfielder signed a minor league deal with the Mets yesterday. Cabrera's never really been a star, but he's tallied hits consistently year after year, more than just about anybody in baseball. Now, for 110sportsmedia.com, I've been ranking the top 10 players at each position of the last decade, and left field hasn't come out yet, but spoiler alert, Cabrera comes in 10th, and he leads all left fielders in hits last decade. As baseball writer John Taylor pointed out on Twitter yesterday, Cabrera has more hits than, among other players, Ryan Braun, Chase Utley, Joey Votto, Edwin Encarnacion, Curtis Granderson, Matt Kemp, Nelson Cruz, Ryan Zimmerman. This guy has just hit and hit and hit really consistently. So let's appreciate that durability, just a fun little stat there, and hopefully Cabrera gets a shot with the Mets this season. All right, so now final thoughts for today. And this may look a little bit different, the final thoughts, each show to show. Really, it's just one point I want to stress today, which is that there have been people complaining. There are always going to be people that complain. That's just the nature of the world about the differences that are going to exist in baseball this season. From the schedule to the rules changes, people obviously wanted a longer regular season. I think everyone did, for the most part. You could argue the owners didn't, not if they had to pay full cost for it. And so, we're here in this situation with a 60-game season. Ideally, we'd have more. Ideally, a lot of things would be different, but we just need to embrace the wackiness that is going to be the 2020 baseball season if it does indeed get off the ground. It's going to be strange. It's going to be shorter. Weird things are going to happen. There are going to be flukes. There are going to be teams that get unlucky in their scheduling, in the circumstances, in things that are outside their control. Rules changes could lead to some unfairness in certain situations, but there are reasons why these things are the way they are, and many of them, the schedule in particular, cannot be changed now. They're not going to go back and make it 80 games all of a sudden. We can't go back. We can only go forward, and it's going to be really important that we just embrace the wackiness of this MLB season, because I'm pretty sure we can all agree some baseball, even if in a different form, is a whole lot better than no baseball at all. So, fingers crossed that we have baseball in 2020, that it does get off the ground and go successfully. Same with other sports, but of course, there's a big picture to keep in mind here as well. Coming up on Thursday's show, we'll talk a little bit about some of the players that you should watch out for out of the gates in the 2020 abbreviated season. We talked about some teams that could be beneficiaries of the shortened season. On Thursday, we'll talk about some players that could be beneficiaries of the shortened season and could come out of the gates some notoriously strong starters. We'll talk about them and the impact they could have for their team, because like we talked about, the games matter more. A team gets off to a horrible start, that could bury them, but if a team gets off to a great start, that adds a bit of a cushion and is very meaningful. But that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in for the debut of Around the Bases here on the 110 Sports Network. Don't forget to check out all the written content available at 110sportsmedia.com, including our ongoing series regrading NFL and NBA drafts of the 2010s, ranking the top MLB players at each position of the last decade, and ranking the top 100 college basketball players of the last decade. That's just among some of the content that we have live now at 110sportsmedia.com. And remember that 110 Sports live coverage continues tomorrow, right here, where you're watching this, with the J Mole Show with Josh Molinix at 11 a.m. Eastern. And then on Thursday, with Touchline Talk, talking all things soccer with Joshua Doring at 11 a.m. Eastern, with Around the Bases airing just an hour after that. We'll have a lot to talk about. We'll see what changes in the next 48 hours, and we'll be back to talk about it on Thursday. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, and I'll talk to you on Thursday.